The Friday the 13th franchise introduced one of horror cinema's most enduring and commercially successful villains. Jason Voorhees, with his hockey mask and machete, became synonymous with slasher films and summer camp terror. Yet understanding this character's cultural impact requires examining not just the films themselves, but the mythology they constructed, the archetype they codified, and the deeper anxieties they addressed about nature, masculinity, and the consequences of negligence. For mature audiences who experienced the slasher boom of the 1980s or have since discovered these films through cultural osmosis, Jason represents something beyond simple monster. He embodies specific fears about wilderness spaces, parental failure, and the persistence of past traumas, themes that resonate differently as we age and accumulate our own regrets and responsibilities. The original Friday the 13th 1980 famously subverted expectations by revealing that the killer wasn't Jason at all but his mother, Pamela Voorhees. This twist proved crucial to the franchise's mythology, establishing foundational elements that would define subsequent films even as they departed from the original structure. Pamela's motivation, avenging her son's drowning death, caused by negligent camp counselors, provided emotional core the film might otherwise lack. Her grief transformed into murderous rage, created sympathetic dimension despite her horrific actions. This maternal fury suggested that even monstrous behavior emerges from recognizably human emotions, making the horror more psychologically complex than simple sadism. The backstory established Jason as victim before becoming villain. He drowned in 1957 while counselors engaged in sexual activity rather than supervising swimmers. This negligence as original sin became the franchise's moral framework. Those who shirk responsibility, who prioritize pleasure over duty, who fail to protect the vulnerable, face violent consequences. The slasher film's puritanical reputation, punishing sexual activity and substance use, finds its clearest articulation in this premise. Jason's absence from the first film paradoxically enhanced his eventual impact. By existing only in backstory and his mother's deranged memories, he became mythological rather than concrete. When he emerged as the actual killer in subsequent films, he carried this mythic quality, less a person than a vengeful spirit, an elemental force of nature rather than explicable human threat. Friday the 13th Part 2 introduced Jason as the franchise's central killer, establishing the template subsequent films would follow. Yet this Jason differed significantly from later iterations. He wore a burlap sack rather than hockey mask, demonstrated some intelligence and caution, and seemed somewhat human despite his strength and persistence. The iconic hockey mask didn't appear until Part 3, but once introduced, it became instantly synonymous with the character. The mask's blank white surface with simple eye holes created perfect horror icon, immediately recognizable, vaguely human yet completely impersonal, suggesting both sports equipment innocence and disturbing anonymity. Unlike elaborate monster makeup, the mask's simplicity made it more universal and somehow more unsettling. The mask also served practical narrative functions. It concealed Jason's disfigured face, itself inconsistently depicted across films, preventing audiences from reading his expressions or motivations. This opacity reinforced his role as inexplicable force rather than comprehensible character. We could never negotiate with Jason, understand his thinking, or predict his actions based on emotional cues. He remained fundamentally alien despite human origins. As the franchise progressed, Jason became increasingly superhuman. Early films suggested he was simply a strong, resourceful woodsman with survival skills and rage. Later installments made him effectively immortal, surviving injuries that would kill normal humans multiple times over. This escalation toward the supernatural reflected both commercial pressures each sequel needed to raise, stakes, and the character's evolution from person to personification. The franchise's wilderness setting proved as essential as its villain. Camp Crystal Lake represented a specific American ideal, the summer camp as character-building institution where children commune with nature, learn self-reliance, and forge lifelong friendships. By transforming this idyllic space into killing ground, the films violated assumptions about where safety exists. This corruption of pastoral innocence tapped into genuine anxieties about wilderness. Despite romantic celebration of nature's purity, wilderness actually represents danger for unprepared humans, exposure, predation, getting lost. The films literalize these threats through Jason, who belonged to the forest in ways the counselors never could. He knew every trail, every hiding place, every approach to the camp. The counselors were visitors. Jason was native predator. The camp's isolation proved crucial to the horror. No cell phones in early films, no phones at all, no nearby neighbors, no quick escape. Once at Crystal Lake, characters were trapped by geography and their own transportation limitations. This isolation forced confrontation rather than escape, creating confined space where Jason's presence became inescapable. The lakeside setting also carried symbolic resonance. Lakes represent boundaries between known and unknown. We can see the surface, but not what lies beneath. Jason's alleged drowning and his tendency to emerge from the water suggested he inhabited this liminal space between life and death, visible and hidden. The lake became portal to supernatural rather than simply body of water. Friday the 13th crystallized slasher film conventions regarding victim selection and survival. Characters who engaged in sex, drug use, or irresponsible behavior died, while pure characters, typically one virginal final girl, survived to defeat the killer. This pattern led to criticism that slashers enforced regressive moral codes, punishing sexuality and independence while rewarding traditional virtue. Yet this reading oversimplifies the film's actual moral framework. The issue wasn't sexuality per se, but rather distraction and negligence. Characters died because they weren't paying attention, because they ignored warnings, because they prioritized immediate gratification over caution. In this sense, the films reinforced conservative values about responsibility and consequences, rather than specifically targeting sexual activity. The final girl archetype pioneered by films like Halloween but exemplified across the Friday the 13th series presented interesting gender dynamics. Female characters proved more resourceful, intelligent, and survivable than their male counterparts, who typically died through machismo and poor judgment. The final girl succeeded by taking the threat seriously, fighting back strategically, and refusing to give up despite overwhelming odds. From a psychological perspective, these patterns reflect adolescent anxieties about independence and vulnerability. Teenagers away from parental supervision must navigate new responsibilities and potential dangers. The slasher film literalizes fears about what happens when you make wrong choices, when you trust the wrong person, when you ignore warning signs. Jason becomes the consequences of poor judgment made manifest. Unlike other iconic slashers who developed distinct personalities, Freddy's sadistic humor, Chucky's profanity, even Michael Myers' uncanny head tilts Jason remained essentially blank. He never spoke, except briefly in one poorly received sequel, displayed no personality beyond murderous persistence, and showed no interest in psychological games with victims. He simply killed, relentlessly and efficiently. This absence of personality paradoxically made Jason more frightening for some audiences. There was nothing to understand, nothing to reason with, nothing human to appeal to. He represented pure violent intent without the complexity that might make him comprehensible. He was force of nature wearing human shape, as indifferent and inexorable as an avalanche. The silence also prevented the character from becoming too campy or comedic. While later Friday the 13th films embraced absurdity and self-parody, Jason himself never winked at the audience or seemed aware of his own ridiculousness. He remained committed to his role as killer regardless of how silly the situations became, maintaining threat level even as surrounding context grew increasingly cartoonish. From a filmmaking perspective, the silence allowed different actors to portray Jason across films without significant continuity issues. Since personality wasn't a factor, physical presence mattered most. Different performers brought varying qualities, some more lumbering, others more agile, but the essential Jason remained consistent because there wasn't much character to maintain beyond basic actions. Jason's repeated deaths and resurrections became franchise trademark. Each film needed to definitively kill him, then bring him back for the sequel through increasingly absurd justifications. He was stabbed, burned, drowned again, buried, resurrected by lightning, possessed by demonic forms, sent to space, and eventually rebooted entirely. This pattern reflected commercial imperatives successful. Franchises don't kill their golden geese permanently, but also serve thematic purposes. Jason's refusal to stay dead suggested that past sins can't be simply buried and forgotten. The negligence that caused his drowning, his mother's murders, the continuing pattern of irresponsibility at Crystal Lake, these created karma that demanded settling regardless of how many times people tried closing this chapter. The escalating supernaturalism also acknowledged what audiences already understood. Jason couldn't realistically survive what the film subjected him to. Rather than maintain pretense of realism, later films embraced supernatural elements explicitly. Jason became officially undead, a revenant sustained by rage or demonic forces, rather than simply an unusually tough human. This evolution toward the supernatural changed the character's thematic significance. Human Jason represented concrete consequences of specific negligence, a tragedy that could have been prevented by responsible action. Supernatural Jason became more abstract. Unstoppable past, inescapable guilt, the impossibility of redemption for certain transgressions. The mythology shifted from cautionary tale to something closer to Greek tragedy. Friday the 13th's commercial success helped establish slasher films as dominant horror subgenre throughout the 1980s. The franchise's formally isolated setting, teenage victims, masked killer, creative deaths, became template that countless imitators followed with varying success. This proliferation eventually exhausted the format, leading to slasher film decline in the early 1990s. Jason became cultural shorthand for slasher villains generally, even surpassing Michael Myers, who predated him, in popular recognition. The hockey mask achieved iconic status comparable to Dracula's cape or Frankenstein's flat-top head, instantly recognizable even to people who'd never seen the films. This cultural penetration made Jason reference point for parody and homage across media. The character also contributed to ongoing debates about media violence and its effects. Friday the 13th films featured increasingly elaborate and graphic death sequences, raising concerns about desensitization and potential copycat behavior. While research generally doesn't support direct causal links between fictional violence and real-world behavior, the franchise's explicit gore pushed boundaries regarding what mainstream Hollywood films would depict. From a filmmaking perspective, the Friday the 13th series demonstrated that horror franchises could sustain commercial viability across numerous sequels despite diminishing critical reception and creative quality. The film's established pattern later followed by Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, and others of annual or semi-annual installments that prioritized brand recognition over individual film quality. The 2009 Friday the 13th reboot attempted updating the franchise for contemporary audiences while respecting core elements. Produced by Michael Bay's Platinum Dunes, known for horror remakes, the film compressed the first 3 films' storylines into streamlined origin story before jumping to contemporary slasher scenario. The reboot presented Jason as more tactical and intelligent than his shambling zombie portrayal in later original films. This Jason set traps, maintained underground lair networks, and demonstrated strategic thinking beyond simple pursuit. These changes made him more threatening and somewhat more realistic while sacrificing the supernatural menace of undead Jason. Critical and audience response proved mixed. The film succeeded commercially, demonstrating continued market for Jason-centered horror, but failed to launch the sustained reboot franchise producers hoped for. The slasher format itself felt dated to audiences accustomed to different horror approaches, and the film couldn't quite decide whether to honor franchise tradition or completely reimagine it. The reboot's struggles illustrated how certain horror icons remain bound to specific eras. Jason Voorhees emerged from early 1980s cultural context Cold War anxieties, specific moral panics about teenage behavior, practical effects-driven horror aesthetics. Transplanting him into the digital age required updates that risked losing essential character elements while maintaining enough tradition to potentially feel stale. Beneath the surface-level formula, Friday the 13th franchise explores interesting psychological terrain. The central theme of negligence causing tragedy that echoes across decades resonates with genuine guilt about failures of responsibility. Most adults carry some regret about times they failed others through distraction, selfishness, or simple human fallibility. Jason embodies the fear that these failures might have consequences we can never escape. Pamela Voorhees represents maternal love corrupted into destructive force. Her inability to process Jason's death healthily, her transformation of grief into homicidal rage, reflects fears about what happens when normal emotions become pathological. She also inverts the protective mother archetype rather than sheltering the innocent. She murders them, creating a perverse mirror of maternal care. The franchise's treatment of sexuality reveals complex attitudes. On surface, the films seem puritanical, punishing sexual activity. Yet the actual dynamic is more nuanced. Characters die not because they have sex, but because sex makes them vulnerable and distracted. The films acknowledge teenage sexuality as normal, while suggesting that combining it with negligence and poor judgment in dangerous situations creates risk. From a trauma perspective, Jason himself represents arrested development. He died or nearly died as a child, and in various continuities, remains childlike despite adult body. His violence might be understood as massive tantrum, inability to process abandonment and betrayal in healthy ways. This reading makes him simultaneously more sympathetic and more disturbing eternal child with adult strength and weapons. Contemporary audiences encounter Jason primarily through cultural references, parodies, and retrospective viewing rather than as cutting-edge horror. Yet the character maintains relevance for several reasons. He represents a specific era in horror cinema that many view nostalgically, embodying practical effects work and straightforward storytelling that seems refreshing compared to contemporary horror's often complex narratives. Jason also endures because the archetype he represents, implacable, unstoppable threat, remains fundamentally frightening regardless of execution quality. The idea that something pursues you without exhaustion, without mercy, without possibility of reasoning or escape, taps into primal flight response. Jason may be absurd on reflection, but in the moment of viewing, that persistence creates genuine tension. The character's blank slate nature allows projection of various meanings. He can represent environmental revenge nature, striking back against human encroachment. He can symbolize past traumas that communities fail to address properly, returning with violence. He can embody class resentment, the disfigured outcast killing privileged teenagers. This interpretive flexibility keeps Jason relevant across changing cultural contexts. For audiences aged 35 to 60, Jason carries additional resonance as marker of generational experience. Those who saw Friday the 13th films during their original runs remember them as defining horror experiences, cultural touchstones shared with peers. Revisiting Jason means revisiting younger selves and examining how relationships with horror entertainment evolve across decades. Jason Voorhees persists in cultural consciousness because he successfully codified the slasher villain archetype while maintaining enough distinctiveness to avoid complete genericization. The hockey mask provided instantly recognizable branding. The camp setting created memorable location. The negligence-based backstory provided emotional foundation. Together, these elements created character that transcended individual film quality to become genuine icon. The franchise's willingness to embrace absurdity rather than fight it also contributed to longevity. By the time Jason went to space or battled Freddy Krueger, the films acknowledged their own ridiculousness while still delivering what fans wanted: creative kills, sympathetic final girls, and Jason's relentless presence. This self-awareness allowed the franchise to continue long past the point where straight horror would have become unsustainable. Yet something valuable exists beneath the schlock. The original films, particularly the first and second, captured genuine tension about wilderness danger, negligence consequences, and the impossibility of escaping past mistakes. Before Jason became cartoon character, he represented something more psychologically resonant: the price of failing to protect the vulnerable, the persistence of trauma, the way one moment of negligence can echo across decades. For modern viewers, Jason Voorhees functions as both entertainment and artifact. We can enjoy the films on their terms: fun slasher romps with memorable kills, while also examining what they reveal about their era's anxieties and values. We can appreciate the craft of practical effects work while recognizing the formulaic nature of plots. We can be simultaneously amused and unsettled by a man in a hockey mask wielding a machete. The character endures ultimately because horror needs its icons, its recognizable figures that carry accumulated cultural weight. Jason Voorhees earned that status through sheer persistence, literally and metaphorically. Just as his character refuses to stay dead within franchise continuity, the franchise itself refuses to completely fade from cultural relevance. Each new generation discovers these films, experiences that distinctive Friday the 13th atmosphere, and comes to understand why a silent man in a hockey mask became shorthand for slasher horror itself. Whether experienced as straightforward scares, camp entertainment, or cultural archaeology, the Friday the 13th franchise and its central figure remain relevant because they captured something essential about horror's appeal: the thrill of confronting unstoppable threats from positions of vulnerability, the satisfaction of seeing resourceful heroes overcome impossible odds, and the recognition that our past mistakes, like Jason himself, may refuse to stay buried no matter how desperately we wish they would. In the end, Jason Voorhees matters not because he's the most sophisticated horror creation, but because he's among the most persistent, and persistence, as the films demonstrate, counts for more than almost anything else.